Lenses with a focal length above 50 millimeters are referred to as long lenses. As we looked at in the last tutorial, wide-angle lenses create more apparent space between objects, but long lenses compress the space between objects. In this shot of the preacher, we used a 50 millimeter lens, which is similar to human vision. Or in other words, this slider shot gives us an accurate representation of what this scene might have looked like if we were there on location. The preacher was standing a ways back from the fire and pretty far away from the forest in the background. But in this shot of the preacher, taken from pretty much the same spot as the previous one, we used a very long 400 millimeter lens. It makes it appear that he's both in the middle of the fire and in the middle of the forest, because this is what long lenses do. They compress the space between everything, the space between the subject and the foreground, and the space between the subject and the background, and the space between the camera and the subject, everything. In this shot of Cordelia wandering, I used a focal length of 30 millimeters, which is a wider angle lens. But this shot was filmed from basically the same spot, but with a much longer lens with a focal length of 135 millimeters. You can see the difference that focal lengths make in storytelling here. The wider angle lens makes her journey seem longer because it appears that there is a greater distance to travel. But the longer lens makes the background much larger, which suggests that her journey is more arduous and difficult. Lenses are a great way to control the size of objects in the background. If you've been following these short film training courses, you see this issue that's come up a few times that caused some conflict on our set here. These bad guys in the background seem too close to our heroes, and nobody on set believed that the girls wouldn't be discovered if the bad guys were that close to them. So I just changed the focal length from 85 millimeters to 50 millimeters. The actors remained in the same spot. Now, in retrospect, we probably should have gone down to a 30 millimeter lens, but I was worried at the time that this would make the bad guys in the background seem too small and diminished. It's important to note that small changes in focal length have a much bigger impact with wider lenses than with longer ones. For example, there is a really big obvious difference between a 10 millimeter lens and a 20 millimeter lens, but not that much of a difference between a 210 millimeter lens and a 220 millimeter lens. In the same way that wide-angle lenses keep a lot of stuff in focus, longer lenses keep less in focus. Now that can be a problem when you want to keep the whole scene in focus, but kind of awesome when you're telling a story and you want this gorgeous shallow depth of field, which we're going to look at in the next tutorial. So it can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the needs of your scene. And because longer lenses are better for selectively focusing on things, they also tend to be better for rack focus shots, which we'll again look at later in this chapter. One of the biggest downsides to using really long lenses is that they tend to magnify camera shake. So for handheld shots, use a wide angle lens or maybe even a medium focal length lens of around 30 to 50 millimeters if you have a handheld rig with a little bit more stability. But this is a real issue, folks. I would even suggest that if you're using a lens above 100 millimeters, that you add extra weight to your tripod, because even subtle shakes in the ground can transfer to your footage. And these little subtle shakes can easily be missed in monitors on set, but are really visible in post-production. Now, we're going to be looking a bit more at lenses and focal lengths in our project-based chapters coming up later in this course. But another thing to remember about lenses is that you don't have to match focal length to the shot size. In other words, you don't have to use just wide-angle lenses only on wide shots. When first starting out, many young cinematographers will use lenses primarily based on the zoom needs of the shot. But I found that some of the most interesting and cinematic shots come from using lenses with focal lengths that are contrary to the shot size. In this shot, for example, the shot size is wide, but it was shot with a long lens. Conversely, in this medium close-up shot, we used a wide-angle lens up close to the subject. So if the director calls for a tight shot, don't automatically assume that a long lens will work best. Use the lens that tells the story in the best way. In the next tutorial, we're going to continue our look at lenses as we study how to get that beautiful shallow depth of field look.